Okay, so let's begin this webinar. Hello, I'm Alex. I'm a front-end developer here in Yonder for several years now, and I'm going to be hosting this webinar about progressive web apps together with my colleague Grigi, who can also introduce.
Hi everybody, I'm Alex. I'm also a front-end developer here, a colleague with Alex. My nickname is Gruji, as he said, and I will be the co-host of this session.
Okay, so before we start, just a few ground rules. You can ask your questions in the chat on the right side of your Zoom app, and we'll answer them all at the end of the webinar. Grigi will take care of those, and we'll take them one by one, and we'll answer everybody's questions. Now, for the duration of the webinar, we're going to close our videos just so we have a smoother connection, okay? Good. So, welcome to the webinar about progressive web apps, which is practically a new approach to mobile development. Now, what we're going to talk about during this webinar is specifically what is a progressive web app, and we're going to define that in just a second. What's the development impact of using this new tech, and the product impact, because you have your development process and you also have your end result, and how exactly are PWAs, and we'll call them for the purpose of this webinar, progressive web apps, PWAs, it's a lot easier to pronounce. Well, how exactly do PWAs help with our businesses and our VMSs? Let's start with short, let's say history, small story. First, with the rise of the smartphones, we initially had native apps, right? Then in 2012, hybrid apps appeared, and their main promise was that they can deliver sort of the same product, but with reduced costs, because firstly, you didn't need two types of developers anymore, such as like Android or iOS or even Windows in the old days, if you wanted to support that. Now, practically in 2016, what happened was that PWAs appeared. Now, this is a new technique, let's call it. It's not like a new framework or a new technology. So practically, what is a PWA? Well, to define it simply, let's say it's just a web page with some tricks, right? It's not different from your normal single page application or your website, if you want to call it like that. But it does have some added APIs to it, APIs which are in the JavaScript engine. Practically, it's in the JavaScript community. Let's say these are APIs developed and maintained by the browsers in which the web page runs, so it can behave like a native app. So like I said, it opens in the browser. And here's where it becomes a bit weird. So it opens in the browser, but it's a native app. How does that exactly work? We're going to answer those questions throughout the webinar, but just for now, stick with me. So it behaves like a native app. It opens in a browser, but it does not have all the native capabilities. And this is where we're going to decide whether a PWA is a good idea for our project or our new initiative or not. Before we begin, I want to have a look at these two apps. Practically, it's a small movie we've made. And you can see here we have a split screen and we have two Twitter apps on this phone, right? The one we're going to open one app and the other we're going to open the other app. I just want you to take a small look as soon as it loads and tell me if you can guess which is the progressive web app and which is the native app. Practically, you have a Twitter apps. You log in, and then you can see the tweets list. They both look and feel pretty much the same. And my network's running a bit poorly, but that's no problem. Practically, you're gonna see when you look on these two applications that they work fairly similar and they look fairly similar. Just to spoil the surprise for you, practically the PWA application is on the right side. The network's really acting up for some reason, but practically they look the same, they feel the same, they open the same, but one of them is PWA and one of them is a native. Okay, let's go a bit and check the development impact. Now, what the community says, and there's many articles on the internet, is that PWAs are cheaper to develop, right? And we wanted to find out if that's actually true. So the first place that we looked at is the development process. And you might think initially that it's silly, but practically what we started looking at is those minute tasks which developers do every day to develop their application. And these are practically things that take time based on what technologies you use to develop that application. And they do these things many, 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 many times. Practically the modifying of the code, this one here, even a good developer might do it 100 times a day. If it's a more junior developer or is less experienced, he might do it even more times a day. And you see that there's some differences here. Practically what we have built here is a small basic application. On the left, we have a native Android app. On the right, we have a PWA with practically the same, it's the same end result, but it's a different development environment. What we wanted to see is, at least for this basic example, which could scale, is this thing faster? And what we found out is that a developer, based on just one FTE, practically in his day-to-day work, working 8 hours a day, he can save up practically all of these times combined about 18 minutes per day per FTE. Now, might that not sound like much, but we did some calculations practically, and I'm just gonna open a small Excel here. It's a really basic sheet, right? But it ends up 18 minutes per day. That's 3.75% time saved per year, right? So if you have, for example, a small team, and I've just put here a monthly rate of 1,000 per developer, it's just for show. Yeah. But if you have a small team, let's say 2 developers, you save practically in percentages almost a month's work at the end of the year for a single developer. Now that's a big impact just by looking at this small figure here. So it starts to look promising. PWAs say they can reduce costs. Okay, let's continue to see if that's true. But this first step seems pretty good. Now, as a small disclaimer, of course, this may vary based on each environment that we have. But usually web apps have a less bulky environment than a native or a hybrid one because it has less tech inside of it. Now let's look at that dev environment practically. We saw some numbers. What backs those numbers up? A native app, usually when you develop it, has a heavy dev environment. You need to test it on multiple devices practically. And usually you actually test different applications if it's also cross-platform, right? You need the same test flows done, repeated, exactly the same, but on different devices, iPhone versus Android, for example. And you deliver practically a native file, or several, or 2 practically, if you want to support both Android and Apple. For hybrid, it's pretty much the same thing because the result is still an app, but the development process is different. It's faster, but the end result is the same, which means that the environment needs to support that thing. You develop the same product, the same native file. For a PWA, it has a lighter dev environment because it's just a web app. It doesn't really have any mobile things into the stack, right? It just has some APIs, which the browser connects then to the camera or the GPS. And the good part is for testing is that mostly if it works on your desktop browser, it's also going to work on your phone browser in pretty much the same way because it's still the same browser. For example, Chrome and desktop. There might be some differences, but those are a smaller percentage. So that means that you can actually spend lesser time at testing in some situations. And what you deliver is your normal web app bundle. It's just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So it's easier to do. For the tech stack itself, and I know for native, we have many options out there. We also have Kotlin or other things that compile to native, but for the sake of the presentation, we're not going to go through all of them. Let's just talk about your normal, your general corporates. That's Java, Objective-C, and Swift, right? For a hybrid, The most popular out there are Ionic and React. Now I put React Native there on in the middle because they actually deliver a native app, while Ionic delivers something that works through middlewares. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes, but let's just keep that in mind. For PWA, I called it JavaScript whatever. Well, one of the advantages of the PWA for tech stack is that can use whatever you want. It's just a web app that runs in a browser, but it just needs to add those PWA concepts, which are some APIs implemented in the browser, which helps it connect to your mobile devices, sensors, or cameras, or stuff like that. For native, you need, if you want to support both environments, as in Android and iOS, you're going to need 2 developers. For hybrid, you're going to need 1, but they're going to need to know either Angular and Ionic or React Native. For PWA, you can go either way or something completely different. So it's easier to find, for example, a specialist that can work with a PWA because he can just know anything. Of course, you're probably going to go with Angular or React anyway, but at least you have flexibility. So a small conclusion drawn on how do PWAs fare in terms of development. So you have more freedom with specialists, you have faster development speed, and you can transition to a hybrid without a full rewrite. This is something we thought about. Practically, Angular can transition to Ionic and React to React Native with far lesser effort than you would with a, let's say, cross-framework transformation. And this can be interesting for a scenario that we thought about for a POC, but we'll see that at the end. Until now, PWA, at least from what we've seen, seems to support its promise, right? So it should be cheaper, even than a hybrid. Okay, but at what cost, right? Nothing in life is free. So we also looked a bit at what product impact it would have. We're going to look at first at security. Now, in terms of security, practically the hybrid and the native, and not just about security, but about other standards as well, they have standards imposed by the stores, right? You can just write anything there. For PWA, you have custom standards. It's a web app. You write however amount of, let's say, secureness into the app you want. Now, we thought it actually is a double-edged blade because you might not want high standards, you might not need them, but on the other hand, if it's a free-for-all, like you do everything custom, you might have some breaches in your app which you might not want to have. So this practically is dependent on your needs and, of course, on the responsibility of your development team. When it comes to device compatibility, this is where you're going to see that PWAs actually fare worst. And this is where you really need to check if it's good for you or not, because it does reduce costs in theory, but here's what it actually costs you in terms of product. So a native practically is fully compatible. It's written for the OS, it has access to everything, it works. Hybrid has a small drawback. And we had some nasty experiences, at least here at Yonder, with these techs. Practically, they're dependent on some plugins and some middlewares. And to keep the argument short, they have some inconsistencies, either between iOS and Android, or either actually the plugins between themselves. And you're going to waste time trying to fix those. And depending on how bad the problem is, you can waste from a day to a week. But it can happen. It's not that often, but it's there. Actually, for example, Airbnb has let's call it a thrash article on React Native, where they say they actually tried it and they ended up switching back to native because they had a lot of issues because of these inconsistencies. However, this was back when the technology React Native was a bit younger. So they might have ironed out some stuff there. The main thing to consider here is that hybrid does have these drawbacks. Now, for PWA, it's a bit worse, actually, because since they're a web app, they run in the browser, right? So they're dependent on the browser and the browser version. And whatever browser supports from the PWA APIs, like we mentioned, for example, the API to connect to the camera, or the API to work offline. There's a service worker, it's called, for example, or stuff like that. So you're not going to have, at least for now, advanced features. At this moment, for example, it doesn't support Bluetooth. Safari just implemented push notifications. So If your application does support, is heavily reliant on advanced phone features, PWAs aren't that good of an idea. Also, apps that work on iOS versus apps that work on Android sort of have a different look and feel. Maybe different size buttons, maybe where the footer or the header is placed in the buttons, maybe how the transitions between screens work. They're slightly different based on how those phones evolved and how the user base got used to that UX. If you do a PWA, it's just one app, it's just one field. If you want it to behave differently based on the platform, you're going to have to write that code yourself. Whereas hybrid technologies take care of that for you, and native, they're separate to begin with, so they're going to look different anyway. Let's check the performance of these three. So practically, natives are going to have your best performance because they work directly with the device features. It's native code, right? But they do have a high memory usage because it's an entire app that you need to install. Hybrids, they don't work offline, at least not by themselves. You need to add some more technology to it. By the way, when I meant performance, I also said functional performance, not performance. So we're going to talk about in the broader terms of performance. It doesn't work offline unless you add some more technology to it. One solution, for example, you can now add pouch and couch, or you can use Ionics or React's stores, which are some plugins that you can use. So you can do that, but you need to increase the technical depth. It also has a high memory usage, since it's still an application that you deliver, but it does have a very fast setup. Actually, this is one of the advantages of hybrid apps, that it's really quick to build an application for two platforms in a really small amount of time. PWAs, again, have that browser thing. So they're dependent on browsers for their capabilities as well as performance. But the advantage is they have a low memory usage. Practically, you have complete control of what you download on the user's device or what you don't. And they also have a very fast setup. Since it's just a web page, it's very easy to do some scaffolding. You can actually find them on the internet, a lot of them, and they work well for a project startup. Now, when it comes to delivery and installation, practically this is what you deliver, right? For native and for hybrid, it's pretty much the same thing. They're either App Store restricted, or you can deliver the native files to your users directly and bypass that altogether if you have that option. And you deliver two versions, practically, if you want both iOS and Android. And the installation and updates are either user prompted, or they can do them manually, or they can set it on auto update, but it does require user input. For PWAs, it's just a web page. So you deploy it on a server and you access it through a link. Practically, when a user first installs a PWA, what it does, when he first time accesses a PWA, he sees a link, which he goes through Chrome, for example, or through Safari. And if that site is configured to work as a PWA, it's going to ask the user, do you want to install this as an app? And if you say yes, it's just going to appear as an app on your phone. Behind the scenes, it's going to be your browser that does all the hard work, but it's still an app. The advantages of this, you deliver one version, you test one version. Of course, you're going to need to test on Safari and Chrome as well if you want to support both OSs, but at least it's the same code base. There's no differences either, because in the native, there are different code bases, and hybrid, you write the same code, but it's generated differently. So again, it's different code. Here, it's exactly the same. So that gives you more confidence during testing and in the overall quality of the product. And the installation, like I said, is just once. After that, it's just a web page. Every time the user opens it, it's updated. You can actually make it to update behind the scenes if you want to, but the user has nothing to do with that. So it's a lot easier from UX perspective. Let's see how the PWA fares in the product field. So practically, it has more permissive security. Now, this can be a good and a bad thing. It's lacking advanced hardware features. So if you need them, you shouldn't go for a PWA. It's dependent on browsers. So this requires an analysis on whatever project you want to build. If you're thinking about using a PWA, to make sure that your user base has devices that actually support it. And by devices, I also mean those browsers that they have installed on those devices. It has a unified look and feel, Apple versus Android. This may be something that doesn't interest you, but it may be something that does. So this is something to look into. It has a low memory print, which is a good thing. It doesn't have no restrictions based for the stores because it's not in store. It could be, by the way, but if you don't want that, it's not going just not going to happen. And it's just a first install user action only. Practically, he only has to do something when he first installs it, and that's it. Now, let's see exactly how we can, if they're helpful in this stage of their maturity, because they're practically about 2 years old now, and that's, let's say they're not matured yet in terms of technologies. The trend is that they're going to be, the big players seem to back them up, but for now we should be a bit skeptical. But let's see, at least in this stage, how they can help us and if they're a good idea for our businesses. First, let's define when not to use a PWA, just so we can tick that off the table. Like I said, advanced hardware features. If you need that in your app project, that's a no-go. If you support old phones or old phone browsers for whatever reason, this being a new technology is like with all new tech, it doesn't pair well with old devices. An investigation might be suitable depending on what your project needs, but usually it's not a good idea. If you just support Apple tech, for whatever reason, if you just go for Apple, they're laggards in terms of implementing PWA support. I mean, they're pretty good now, but they've been sluggish in the past, and we don't know yet how this is going to evolve. For example, they just implemented push notifications this year, and this is something that's really sought after in a mobile device usually. And if you have lots of client-side processing, if of course you can move that to the server, but if for whatever reason you can't, and you have a heavy client-side app, you're better off going for a native, or maybe even a hybrid, that depends, but you're going to want to benefit from all the entire processing power of your device. Now, let's see when our PWA is suited best. If one or more of these are true for your project, it might be a good idea to at least look into it, right? So we have just basic hardware access, like camera, like GPS, like maybe even a calendar or stuff like that. You have mostly Android with Chrome users, and that's not an absolute necessity. It's a good idea. It's an advantage, but you can support Safari. Like I said, they're laggards, but they're in an okay place right now with support for PWAs. If it needs to work both on web and mobile. Now, if you want the same app on both environments, this is practically where PWAs shine. It's the same code base that runs exactly the same on a mobile screen as it does on a desktop screen. The only thing that you need to look out for is to actually make it responsive. So practically, if you have, for example, in a layout perspective, if you have two columns on a desktop, you're going to have just one column on a mobile because it won't fit. But this is something that you can do with CSS, and it's been done for many years now. If it needs to work offline, PWAs practically by their nature work offline. If they don't, they're not even considered PWAs. And we also have tools out there. There's an audit tool from Google, which is called Lighthouse, which also looks into these things and how well it's implemented. So there's a lot of guidelines out there for developers, which might not be very familiar with PWAs yet, on how to write them in the proper way so they function like a native app. And working offline is part of a native experience. While as, like I said, hybrids need some extra work. If, for example, we need to build a quick MVP or POC. Now, PWAs also have the speed to their advantage. And they also have the speed with offline mode, with delivering to several platforms at once. They're actually developing right now. It's still in sort of a beta, but you can actually deploy PWAs on sort of Windows desktop apps. So you can actually do that. They're getting a lot of traction practically. But if any of these are true, it might be a good idea to do at least an investigation for your project or your new initiative to see if it's a good idea. So we thought about some examples where PWAs might be good practically. In our experience here with the applications that we did until now, which were native or which were hybrid, which ones now would be a good candidate for a PWA. Now, before I continue, this isn't like for all. Of course, we need an investigation for each app in its own right, but it might be a good idea to look into it. So let's take your generic ticketing app. Practically, you have some work that needs done on a field. You have people going out of the office to do stuff, and they need to communicate to report on that work to see if they have work, if they finish the work, and everything gets centralized in an office. A PWA is a good idea for something like this because you can write one app, it works for everybody, for all situations, and it's really easy to build up, especially if it's something small. Let's say we also thought about a scheduler, maybe with a location. We actually did this for a hackathon where we needed to uh, practically schedule meetings in a campus, which also had cafeterias, and you needed to know how close you were to bring clients. So these were practically the requirements. We actually did it in a PWA style, and it turned out pretty good. Everything for tracking assets, let's say, or inventory or transportation or stuff like that. Again, there are assets on the field, people report on them, you have everything centralized in your home office, for example. So what we're saying is that PWAs are best suited, for example, for new initiatives that you want to use to quickly extend your suites with on-field capabilities. As in, you have a big suite that already does a lot of work, but right now you also have people going out and doing stuff, and you need to integrate it with your old code, your old functionality. PWAs can work very well like that because they're just web apps, so they can integrate with any server real quick, and they're really quick to build. They can work offline, but you need to take into account whether your project doesn't have those no-nos, which we discussed when not to use a PWA, because then you reduce costs, but it's not going to fit your purposes, so there's no point on going for them. So this was the webinar. I want to thank you all for participating. And now if we have any questions, I guess we can take a look. Okay, so the first question is, what browsers have support for PWAs? So right now, the main one that is pushing is Chrome, as in the Chrome for the mobile version, but also the desktop one. And Safari is also catching up pretty quick. And these are the browsers which are mostly used on mobile devices today. Okay. I have a team of web developers which are rather new in the domain. How long would it take for them to learn the concepts of PWA? Okay. And how well is the documentation regarding that? Well, practically, if they know JavaScript, they already know PWAs, except they don't know that yet. What you need to learn are just some new APIs, which are really quick and very easy to use. They're exceptionally well documented by Google. For example, one of them, and this is something that you're going to hear a lot in relation to PWAs, it's called service workers. If you have that, you're already well on your way to having a PWA. It's not just that, but it's easy. So overall, it's really easy to catch up on something like this. And the learning curve is really light. I understand that native apps have updates for which the user is notified. How do releases and updates work for PWAs in terms of user notification? Well, if you want the user to be notified, you're going to have to write the code yourself, which has a pop-up or something saying the app was, or a push notification, maybe the app was notified. But that's if you actually want the user to know that there's a new version. Other than that, inside of the app, other than that, they just update like a normal web app. Now, pick any application you have right now, which is just web. It works the same. There's no difference. So if you update your code on your source, it's going to get updated on your server. It's going to get updated the next time the user accesses the application, because it's just like accessing a link. There's no different. Can I upload my PWA app in, let's say, Play Store? Well, you can do it in Play Store. But again, Apple is a bit behind on this, so it's not going to work properly right now. But They have been catching up, so at least they don't have any announcement about this, but I suppose uh, they're gonna implement this as well. Okay, so any more questions? We don't have. There's a question here that says Chrome on iOS. Uh, okay, I gotta admit this one. I haven't really looked into it that much. It's supposedly, so I suppose that since Google is pushing it, they're a very big fan of the PWAs. It's practically sort of like their ideas. I would expect it to work properly, but I can I can look that up and come back to you. Although Grigi just took a very quick look right now, and he says that it should be okay. um, I guess there are no more questions. If if one last mention, guys, if you need more info, you can contact us offline and we can talk about it. Or you can send an email. You can send an email to me, to the other Alex, because we're two Alexes, or you can send it to marketing at TSS Yonder, and Monique's going to forward those questions for us. Thank you for attending. Bye.